Well, hello. My name is Evan Reese, and on behalf of the U.S. Resiliency Council and our series sponsor, Optimum Seismic, welcome to our ninth episode in the Resilience Advantage webinar series. We hope you've learned a great deal during the previous webinars, and if this is your first time with us, we hope you enjoy our program and view some of our past episodes. Today, we're looking at another important subject, policy options before disaster strikes. We'll examine what policy options government officials, the financial industry, and others can develop and put in place before disaster strikes to make buildings more resilient in settings around the world. Advances in seismology, engineering, and computer analysis are making it much faster and easier to improve the performance of buildings in future earthquakes. Unfortunately, our ability to develop and implement new public policies, whether it be in the form of new legislation and budget plans, or regulatory measures such as building codes, don't seem to always move with the same ease and speed. We'll hear today how legislators, building officials, planning and development leaders, nonprofit organizations such as the U.S. Resiliency Council are all working to craft and implement new policies to make our lives, our buildings, and our economy safer in the future. We'll also hear how the USRC is collaborating with our legislative leaders and private industry, including our series sponsor, Optimum Seismic, which has generously provided the financial resources to educate owners about the benefits of investing in resilient buildings, including through this series, the Resilience Advantage. So I'd like to take this moment to thank Optimum Seismic for its commitment to making the Resilience Advantage series possible, for its tireless work they've been doing to raise awareness about the importance of resilient design. And I'm excited that in coming weeks, we will be announcing a new initiative in partnership with Optimum to recognize owners that have invested in retrofitting vulnerable buildings throughout California. The U.S. Resiliency Council is a nonprofit. We founded 11 years ago, and we're working to build community resilience through resilient design. We use building performance rating systems, educational programs such as the Resilience Advantage, and coalition building with key stakeholders to make our built environment, your homes and buildings, more sustainable, prosperous, and resilient. If you want to learn more about the resilience movement, go to our website, www.usrc.org, and you can also view past episodes of the Resilience Advantage there. So with that, it's my pleasure to now introduce today's champions for this episode. Tracy Hernandez is the founding CEO of the Los Angeles County Business Federation. She's an outstanding business community leader, and we're very fortunate to have her with us today. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you tell us, please, a little bit about LA BizFed and its role as a leader in the seismic resilience movement and the policies that are impacting the business community.
Hi, Evan. Thanks for having me. It's always an honor to be here with you. You and the U.S. Resiliency Council are really doing important work, and I appreciate you keeping the drumbeat alive and well and not letting up, because this educational opportunity is needed now more than ever. Let me tell you about BizFed. The LA County Business Federation is a massive grassroots alliance of all the existing business groups into one federation. We have 215 different chambers of commerce, industry, trade groups, minority business groups, women business groups, you name it, all in this one federation representing 410,000 employers. And those employers have 5 million employees here in Southern California. And our purpose is to share fast-moving intel wherever the government's doing anything that impacts the private sector, and us to get employers more civically active so that we can foster really strong economic policies. Like you were mentioning, what is today the whole policy options before disaster strikes. That's a fine example of why we were formed, is to get employers of all shapes and sizes, all sectors, to pay more attention to these things, to engage more, to help our elected office holders have the intel they need to make the right decisions as they're making policies. And so obviously well, maybe not so obvious. I say obvious, but because we're working on it all the time with Optimum Seismic and all of our other business owners about the need to shore up the existing buildings. We're particularly focused in housing. As you know, we have a housing crisis in California. We're short on housing units and availability. The affordability is out of sight, and hence we have, an abundance in our homeless crisis, and people just working can't afford to have a home over their heads. So we need to shore up the existing building stock. There's a lot of apartments that are soft story apartments. We have a lot of different structures that we need to maintain the existing stock as well as focus on building new. And so I know a lot of the good intel that comes that you're bringing to bear. We're trying to educate office holders too, to then bring about policies that will incentivize all those property owners and the tenants that live there to work together to use the public sector money and options along with the private sector money. And then let's just get at it and make sure all those apartment buildings, multifamily buildings, are safe for our people who are our people, are our workers. Our workers are, a big part of the economy. So that's why BizFed cares. That's why we show up. And thank you for having us today.
Tracy, thank you so much. I really just can't express how grateful we are that the business community, especially BizFed, has taken such a leading role in promoting resilience. It's one of the things that the U.S. Resiliency Council has been pushing for a long time to show that, resilience is not just good social policy, it's good business. And so we're really thrilled to have you as a champion for this and many of our other episodes as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second champion for today's episode, Matthew Wall. Matthew's the executive director of the Western States Seismic Policy Council. Matthew's an emergency response policy expert, and we're really fortunate to have him join us as well. So Matthew, thanks again for being here with us. Maybe you could give us a little bit about your background and tell us about the Western States Seismic Policy Council's role as a leader in the seismic resilience movement.
Well, first off, sir, thank you very much for having me on the show. And I'm more than happy and honored to be participating in this process and being able to spread the good message of resilience that we've got going forward here. The Western States Seismic Policy Council was actually founded in 1979 by 8 Western states to be able to start looking at and addressing the questions behind earthquakes with the development of the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, with the creation of FEMA, to start looking at the specific hazard to be able to start addressing some of the policy considerations that exist. Now, the reason that they put it together as a multi-state organization was because they understood that nobody is in this alone. That if we look at things like roads, if we look at things like infrastructure, if we look at things like economies, that they actually transpose from state to state to state. And so a major effect or a major impact on one location may very well have a footprint that spreads beyond the state in its own right. So the coordination of policies and partnerships, the ability to be able to combine the science behind earthquakes and seismic events to create policies that are science-based but also implementable is something that's of critical importance as we're going forward here. Now, you asked about my background. I had the honor to spend 26 years in the City of Richmond, Virginia Fire Department, where I retired from them, and then I went to go work for the Virginia State Emergency Management. While I was at the Virginia Emergency Management, I filled several roles, to include that as State Hazard Mitigation Officer, as well as working in operational capacities at the Emergency Operations Center. As a State Hazard Mitigation Officer, one of the things that I had to do was actually communicate with the localities to be able to say, what are your hazards? What do you have to look at? How is it that you have to be able to adapt to this? And this brings us to a critical and key point, that what we're looking at is that we're not just looking at the natural hazards themselves, because any place can have an earthquake, any place can have a wildfire. But what we want to be able to do is look at it and say, what effect does this have on the people? So when we're talking about resiliency, we talk about structures and the good building work that's being done, the resilience components that are associated with retrofitting structures. Examples include the Brace and Bolt program in California, the Fix the Bricks program in Salt Lake City. But we're also looking at what are the social vulnerabilities that are out there? What are the considerations that need to be looked at to be able to protect them too? Roughly speaking, that's where I come from. That's what we do here at WISPIC, sir.
Matthew, thank you so much. What you just highlighted is really a major part of how we see resilience, and you'll all of our viewers, you'll see that in our video today, that it really is about bringing all the stakeholders together, recognizing that it's not just an engineering problem, it's just not just a lending or a finance or a business continuity problem. It's an issue that affects this very social fabric of our communities, and that's why it takes coalition building on bringing together diverse stakeholders to really get behind this idea of resilience. So, and you will see Matthew again. He is going to be on our panel today after the video, so we're excited to have him there. Now I'd like to thank our major partners, several organizations which have worked for years to focus the attention on the vital message of earthquake resilience for our business community. Our major partners include the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, Los Angeles County Business Federation, BizFed, you just heard from Tracy, of course, the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, and Optimum Seismic. So again, thank you all so much for continuing to support the work that we do. And I'd also like to thank all of our champions for this episode and past episodes in the series who have worked hard to promote the seismic resilience and support the important message that this series is trying to get out. So our goal in this series is to tell the story of how investing in readiness for natural disasters benefits all of us. Each episode is focused on a specific part of the story. Prior episodes on resilient communities, resilient new construction, and retrofitting existing buildings have all shared important information. And today we'll examine how all of these topics blend together in the public policy arena to increase our resilience. We need to carefully examine our public policy options to make the right choices in earthquake resilient design and moving the movement forward. So as we start this video, first of all, I'd like to once again thank our friends at Compassion Unlimited for their hard work and their artistry in weaving together these dozens of virtual interviews, visuals, and case studies to make this vision a reality. So we hope you enjoy this episode and stay tuned following for a very informative discussion with our panelists.
Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese. In this series, we're exploring what resilience means to the long-term sustainability of our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and now even pandemic. In this episode, we consider how disaster resilience is being driven at the public and private levels, and how the proper policies can motivate building owners and all stakeholders in the built environment towards long-term thinking. We'll discuss two types of disaster-resistant policy: mandatory ordinances and financial incentives. Both are being used by local, state, and federal governments, companies, and financial institutions to push and pull stakeholders toward building more resilient communities. The first type of disaster-resilient policies we'll discuss are local or state ordinances that require older, vulnerable buildings to be seismically retrofitted.
Many of those were built in the 50s and 60s, maybe into the 70s. Our engineers at the time learned that unreinforced masonry buildings were not going to be good performers in earthquakes. Many of them collapsed, caused a lot of the damage as well as the deaths and injuries in that earthquake. If you jump forward to the 1971 San Fernando earthquake in Southern California, that really highlighted the vulnerability of a class of reinforced concrete buildings that had been built in the 1950s and 60s, what we call non-ductile concrete. And really that's the type of concrete that doesn't hold together and doesn't have the ability to flex in an earthquake. Jump forward to the 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles. We learned lessons there about steel buildings, steel moment frame buildings, as well as what we call tuck under parking or soft story construction, and also reconfirmed a type of construction we call tilt up construction, where we have concrete walls and wood roofs. You think of large office park type of areas where those have a lot of damage in that earthquake.
Several cities, primarily in California, have passed ordinances over the past 20 years that require one or more of these vulnerable building types to be seismically retrofitted to better protect their occupants.
We can point to about 10 or 15 largely California cities that have adopted, in particular, retrofit ordinances for various building types that are known to be higher hazard. Each community tends to do it in their own way. These are local negotiations between the different stakeholders. So in some communities, rent control is an issue. In San Francisco and Oakland, they had to make negotiations over how much of a retrofit cost could be passed through to tenants. In other cities, rent control isn't a problem, but the business community argues that they need special financing or incentives in order to be able to justify the costs of the retrofits. So the emphasis in that city might be on ways to get money into partnerships that will make these projects possible.
Soft story structures have been a major focus of many cities because they are often apartment buildings that house some of our most vulnerable or elderly populations. San Francisco was the first large city in the nation to adopt a soft story retrofit ordinance. Patrick Ottolini was the city's chief resilience officer when the ordinance was passed in 2013.
Primarily, our signature program was the soft story ordinance. Improving the homes of 120,000 San Franciscans that live in rent-controlled apartments is probably one of the single biggest efforts we've done to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing in San Francisco. It's huge.
Educating and giving the public information on their earthquake risks is essential for achieving broad support for mandatory ordinances.
When you're doing this, you're asking people to think about things that they don't like to think about. And especially when they think about their property, which is usually their largest financial asset, and that it might be at risk or exposed in terms of seismic risk, you start to see light bulbs go off. And I think that's really important because, getting the public behind this, getting consensus around thought about seismic safety is huge, and it's a tough thing to do. So these programs take great steps on informing the public and getting them on board.
As we've said throughout this series, the occurrence of natural perils is a matter of when, not if. If we could predict that the next earthquake would hit San Francisco within a week, most of us would take whatever action we could right away. But stretch that timeline out to years or even decades, and many people don't worry about something so potentially far away.
So getting people to think about long-term strategies is a very difficult thing, and it's a very hard thing to get leadership to be able to push forward ordinances or requirements for retrofits because of this reason. Now, putting good science in front of these leaders, showing them the situation about the potential damage, about what our recovery looks like, about what our displaced resident count would look like, that starts to get the attention of people. Because one thing we know is disasters make existing societal problems worse.
Another success story for how a city, one smaller than San Francisco, successfully implemented a comprehensive seismic mitigation program is Santa Monica, California. Ron Takaguchi, who is now the building official in Burbank, California, was Santa Monica's building official and was instrumental in guiding the city through the development of its retrofit ordinances. Education and awareness were key to bringing all stakeholders together to pass ordinances requiring that vulnerable buildings be seismically retrofitted.
Santa Monica was successful in having their seismic retrofit program initiated and passed by the community and city council, mostly because of the recognition of seismic risks to the city and the greater need for continuity and resilience. It's recognized that each city could be on their own for several days if not several weeks, and resiliency is the key. The challenges are similar, I think, wherever you introduce a seismic retrofit program, and some of it is the typical things that you hear. I didn't have damage in the 1994 Northridge earthquake, although the neighbors might have. So maybe my building is stronger, maybe my building is less at risk. It took a bit of convincing from the scientific community. One of our greatest advocates, of course, is Dr. Lucy Jones, who advocates not only for earthquake safety, but building safety. And she was gracious enough to spread the word with California building officials, and she came personally to the city of Santa Monica, and she's worked personally with the city of Los Angeles in helping spread the word about building and seismic safety.
So retrofit is something that's really important in our community for so many reasons. There's so many liabilities around the aspect of vulnerable buildings in our community that not only impact the business person themselves, but it impacts their employees, it impacts the community. We know that there's over 1,400 buildings that have been tagged as vulnerable buildings in our community. Our city has done their job on reaching out to those businesses to let them know that they have responsibility to correct this and to move forward and make their buildings safer.
When cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Santa Monica pass and successfully implement mandatory retrofit ordinances, it makes it easier for other cities to follow.
I think all cities could benefit from the efforts of cities that have initiated seismic retrofit programs by recognizing their own city, recognizing where vulnerabilities might be, taking the effort to look at records, advocating the community with seismic safety awareness, and where possible, approaching the city council and getting funds for consultant services to help develop a seismic retrofit program.
These California communities have helped pave a path that is easier for other cities to follow, including how to work with segments of the community that might not be very enthusiastic about the new mandate.
It's also not necessary to jump in with both feet and mandate retrofits of all the vulnerable building types at once.
What I would say to cities that are worried about going to the mandatory policy step is that there's a lot of options they can take short of that will still do a lot of good. One of them is to inventory vulnerable buildings in your community. And that's actually a really essential first learning step in order to assess how important this issue really is. So once you get some facts on the ground, what buildings you have, of what types, who owns them, what stakes are involved in your community in tackling this problem, then you're much better informed to know how to prioritize this against other issues your community is facing and who you need to build coalitions together with in order to make progress.
Small cities can do a lot. People think of San Francisco as a big city with big resources, and yes, that's true. But those resources weren't tapped in terms of dollars to be able to launch this program. This was all about community. So if you get a community behind an idea or a concept, it's more powerful than people give credit to it. One of the things I did a lot when I worked for the City and County of San Francisco was lend ourselves and our expertise to smaller cities, working with cities like Berkeley or Alameda. We worked with everyone from local building departments to elected leaders to share our stories. And that was one of the most favorite experiences I had, is because we could show them what we did and what we had done right, but we were also very honest about where we could improve.
While most mandatory ordinances deal with mitigation of older, vulnerable buildings, some owners are making resilience a requirement for new buildings. In past episodes, we highlighted both the state of Oregon and the state of California, which required resilience to be considered and incorporated into the design of new office buildings, both to protect the state's considerable investments and to make sure that the buildings would remain functional when a disaster strikes. We've discussed the first disaster resilience policy, mandates, the stick, so to speak. So let's turn to the carrot, incentivization. When a building is made more resilient, many stakeholders benefit. Of course, the owner protects their property and business and also reduces their liability. But cities, counties, and states also benefit by having a more stable tax and economic base after a disaster. A mortgage lender benefits when the risk of a borrower defaulting on a damaged property is reduced, and insurance companies reduce the risk of costly claims. It seems natural that these other stakeholders who benefit when buildings are made more resilient should contribute to the cost of making them so, and not leave it all up to the owner. Unfortunately, as we learned in a previous episode from Jonathan Cohen, who renovated the historic Society Hotel in Portland, Oregon, these incentives are often hard to come by.
There are some incentives out there. One of the incentives is a really attractive loan that our urban renewal organization, which is called Prosper Portland, offers, and we did take advantage of that. But there was really no priority in permitting, no special perks, no assistance, no leniency whatsoever. And it's a real problem for doing this type of work, and it's a real barrier to why there's not more of our buildings that are prepared for resilience in Portland.
Business owners generally recognize that having safe and resilient buildings is important to their businesses. And several chambers of commerce and business associations are working to partner with local jurisdictions to make resilience a win-win for everyone.
Well, I think one of the ways that we're going to get our businesses to actually retrofit is finding incentives, whether it's a private-public partnership, or it's a city-funded program, or it's coming from some of our larger utility companies, or and I think that's the most important thing right now is to create support so it does happen.
Anything that's going to be a mandate from government that increases your cost is businesses a bit wary, as you might imagine. We prefer the voluntary and the incentive programs, and then people go. That's much better. That's like a win-win operation. Rather than mandating that everyone have to comply, they say, we will either expedite your permitting, we'll offer some incentives, this is a good thing, and if you do it, there's some other reward that comes into play, through the government process. Those are the things we tend to, both our members, the companies, respond to, because the ones that have some appetite or willingness, then it helps them move faster, farther, go to it. We definitely understand both sides of the equation, and there's a gentle balance around how much is encouragement, paving the way, using the carrots to get people to go, and then how much is the stick, saying it has to be done for the betterment of our lives here and our communities.
So I would say at the very baseline, it would be permitting. If there's a way to fast track the permitting that shows a public and private partnership where the city acknowledges that they're making these changes because they're creating safer buildings for the community, safer buildings for employees, safer buildings in our city, that there really shouldn't be red tape there or long drawn out processes. Additionally, I think if there's, a micro grant / loan program where maybe the overall cost isn't completely burdensome on the employer, that there's some funding available where, the initial cost to get the ball rolling was achieved through a micro grant.
There are a number of other creative incentives that cities can offer owners who build more resiliently and reduce existing property risks.
One tool cities can offer is exemptions or special privileges for buildings designed to meet higher resilience standards. So maybe you offer a little more parking, maybe you offer relief from parking rules. If you're able to make trade-offs in what you give an owner to be able to invest in resilience, that can be a real win-win.
Just like Patrick Odolini mentioned earlier about the need to bring stakeholders together to form consensus around resilience mandates, having local and state leaders as champions to partner with the private sector is the best way to bring incentives to bear.
I think it's critical that the state takes appropriate steps to further incentivize local jurisdictions to want to also go that route. And so I think it's going to be very important for the state to come up with incentive programs, whether through tax credits or loan programs, to ensure that local jurisdictions are taking advantage of these programs and then further either incentivizing or requiring their businesses and residents to make the upgrades necessary for their safety.
Earlier in this episode, we talked about the need to have a long-term perspective when it comes to investing in disaster resilience. Unfortunately, many owners facing the short-term pressures of day-to-day cash flow don't always have that luxury. Insurance companies, by their very nature, are long-term thinkers. There are examples, particularly in the Southeast and Midwest, where insurance companies have worked with state and local governments to offer insurance discounts to building owners who have made their properties more resilient to wind and flood.
In places like Florida, for example, with hurricanes, if you have a new Florida building code structure, you have a 40% of your premium, you have an option to get a discount on that premium each and every year. So whenever we do a good job helping people see the linkage between having hurricane shutters and every year you get a discount, and after 3.7 years it pays for your shutters, then we win with incentives.
The California Earthquake Authority, which oversees much of that state's earthquake insurance, is currently helping single-family owners retrofit unbraced crawl spaces and reduce their insurance premiums.
The Earthquake Brace and Bolt program started in just 4 zip codes, 2 in Oakland and 2 in Los Angeles in 2013 and 14. And since that pilot program, we have retrofitted or assisted in the retrofit of over 10,000 houses. The program provides up to $3,000 towards this cripple wall retrofit, which consists of just anchor bolts and plywood around the crawl space and some framing clips at the top of that cripple wall.
There will always be pressing needs today that lead us to say it's just not a good time to invest in resilience for the future. But the truly devastating toll that disasters take on societies demands that we better balance our short and long-term goals. Building owners alone cannot be expected to shoulder the entire burden. All users of buildings benefit when they are made more resilient to natural hazards, and so all users should share in the cost of doing so. The U.S. Resiliency Council is committed to bringing together these stakeholders to form consensus around disaster-resilient policies that include both mandates and financial incentives. The only way we can succeed in making sure that the next natural hazard event does not become a disaster is by working together. Thank you for joining me on the Resilience Advantage.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you again to all of those that we featured in it. So you heard today that one of the most important requirements to achieve policy success is the ability for all stakeholders, often some with competing interests, to come together to recognize a shared benefit when it comes to resilience. One example of how the USRC is working today to achieve this kind of shared mission is around the retrofit of multifamily housing known as soft-story buildings. I'd like to share one more brief video about a policy proposal that the USRC has been working on in recent months to protect existing affordable multifamily housing from earthquakes.
The COVID-19 pandemic impacted California and our nation. Our friends, families, neighbors, and whole communities bore much of this disaster. But what happens if another disaster strikes? One that we can already predict will. If a major earthquake struck California today, housing across the state would be destroyed, and the toll could be unimaginably grim. But there is hope. The American Rescue Plan Act, a $1.9 trillion federal stimulus, is key to resuscitating our economy and protecting Californians for years to come. After everything we've faced this past year, a portion of California's ARPA funds must be allocated to prevent future earthquakes from devastating our homes and businesses. Hundreds of thousands of Californians live in older soft-story apartment buildings, which are at a high risk of collapse. These affordable buildings attract vulnerable, low-income seniors and working families, people most hurt by the pandemic. Most of these older soft-story buildings also have mom-and-pop owners, people who don't have the resources to protect their properties and the lives within. How do we solve this catch-22? According to the U.S. Resiliency Council, today we have a unique opportunity to mitigate future earthquake disasters by allocating a portion of American Rescue Plan funding to help apartment owners with 5 to 20 units seismically retrofit their properties. Setting this plan in motion will stimulate our economy and protect more than 200,000 Californians, many of them among our most vulnerable. Why do mom-and-pop apartment owners need this help? Simply put, small property owners often lack the money to make buildings earthquake safe. Apartment owners have been financially crippled during the pandemic. These small business owners have been squeezed financially by lost rent, continuing mortgage payments, eviction restrictions, rent control, and skyrocketing insurance costs. Protecting these older, affordable housing units is essential to reviving our economy and protecting our people. If homelessness isn't enough now, imagine 200,000 more people on the streets. We can't afford to lose critical affordable housing to major earthquakes. As the U.S. Resiliency Council proposes, by investing $400 million for retrofit grants with a match by owners, $800 million can be invested to make 80,000 units with 200,000 tenants safer from earthquakes. For every $1 spent on seismic retrofitting, $13 will be saved in future losses. Property owners and businesses protect their investments. Tenants avoid death, injury, and homelessness. Lenders and insurers minimize financial risk. Governments mitigate economic collapse and disaster relief. Environmentalists win by minimizing the carbon footprint of having to build new structures from scratch. All stakeholders win. The American Rescue Plan Act can be the foundation for a strong recovery if our government authorities and property owners act quickly. Using this once-in-a-lifetime economic stimulus opportunity to invest in California's safety and protect affordable multifamily housing will provide benefits we will reap well into the future, with billions of dollars saved and many thousands of lives protected. Let's invest smartly today so we can build back California stronger and safer than ever.
Bringing our federal and state resources to bear to protect our most vulnerable populations is a win for everyone. And given California's record budget surplus and our awareness in just the past month of the vulnerability of housing around the nation with the Surfside collapse in Miami, the time is absolutely right to invest in the resilience of our existing housing stock. And as you can see from these slides, which lists our partners and supporters in this effort, it is an unusually diverse group of organizations that's come together to support this policy concept. So we truly hope this is an example of the kinds of things that we can do and accomplish by working together. So before we jump into our panel, I just wanted to note that we have several white papers that we've written in conjunction with Optimum Seismic. And you can find those on our website or on www.optimumseismic.com/whitepapers. And this describes in some more detail the sort of the social and economic benefits of building resiliently. So with that, I'm actually very pleased to get to our panel discussion. We have assembled a great group of panelists today to talk about issues around policy and resilience. We are incredibly pleased to welcome distinguished California Assembly member Adrian Nazarian, who represents the state's 46th district. You saw him in our video, and he has long been a champion of seismic resiliency in the state. Ron Takiguchi is the Assistant Director of Community Development and the city building official in Burbank. And of course, you saw him on the video as well. He's also the past president of the California Building Officials, and we'll talk with him a little bit about his role there. We're very pleased to welcome Carlos Martin, a senior fellow with the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center with the Urban Institute. And we're really pleased to have his thoughts on how philanthropy and other sort of larger scale initiatives can be brought to bear to protect our vulnerable communities. And then we welcome Matthew Wall, who's the executive director of the Western States Seismic Policy Council, who is one of our champions for today. So, gentlemen, I want to just kick this off and start with Assemblyman Nazarian. Now, I've mentioned that you've been a champion of seismic safety for many years. I'll just give a little background that I've been a structural engineer for 30 plus years, and it seems that there's always someone in the state legislature that rises to the top as sort of taking the torch from one generation to the next in seismic resilience. And I've had the pleasure of meeting some of those men and women in the past, and I'm just so grateful that you have taken up that same torch with your passion. So let me ask you, what really sparked your interest in seismic policy and seismic resilience?
First of all, thank you, Evan, for having me. I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Good. Okay. Not sure if my laptop works well. That's why if there's a delay, I'm happy to change it over to my phone. For whatever reason, cell phone reception works a lot better than the laptop. To answer your question, though, first of all, thank you to the U.S. Resiliency Council for hosting this very important event. I'm glad that this is getting the continued coverage and continued bringing up to people's attention that's necessary and raising awareness. We talk about climate change and wildfires, and we spend billions of dollars towards wildfires, but we don't do nearly enough when it comes to earthquake resiliency. So to answer your question, in '94, I was in college. I was transitioning from Cal State Northridge to UCLA. I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget how my brother grabbed me out of, came over and grabbed me out of my bed because I was sound asleep and I could feel the rattling, but I couldn't tell exactly what was going on. It was a very scary feeling. And growing up in Southern California, we've all gone through quite a few earthquakes, but the sound of the rumbling of the '94 Northridge earthquake was like something that I'd never heard before, and the continued aftershakes as well were extremely scary. So when you see how vulnerable you are to Mother Nature, there isn't much you can do to change. What you can do is take preventative steps. Make sure that your buildings are stronger. Make sure that you're educating your public of what to do. Make sure that you have programs in place that can give you the awareness or the alert, just seconds enough to stop certain vital procedures or surgeries or steps that are life critical, and you only need seconds to be able to stop what you're in the middle of. So if we take proactive steps in trying to fix some of those circumstances, address some of those circumstances, we won't be able to obviously get rid of earthquakes, but we will be able to minimize the damage, the significant damage that it causes. And I wanted to point out the earthquakes because we keep talking about and put billions of dollars towards wildfires. It's become the topic du jour. But the reality is all it takes from what we saw in that '94 was 17 seconds of rattling that caused billions of dollars of damage. And so, uh, the three things that I've committed myself to working on since I've been in office have been, first of all, identifying and taking inventory. It's critical to know what we're dealing with. So I had a bill on figuring out incentives, come up with incentives that help businesses to figure out what they can take advantage, what assistance there is to take advantage, so that it's not borne upon them to address all the issues. And the state has a big role in this. If we can't be the guarantor of that support, good luck waiting for the federal government to come and do that. So it was critical for the state, especially given the seismicity level of California compared to all the other 49 states. And the only one that rivals us is Alaska. It was critical for our state to make the hard investments necessary to make sure that we're incentivizing our building owners, our business owners, to take the proactive steps in protecting their tenants and their residents. And then last but not least, modifying the way we do things, looking at our building codes and seeing how we can strengthen it. I'm not a geologist. I'm not a geologist. I'm getting a text, a message that says it's pretty choppy. So if I need to stop and get on my cell phone, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, so Assemblyman, I think we'll have you do that. I have a few other questions for you, but why don't you just reconnect with your cell phone, and I'll continue on. But I do have some other questions for you, so thank you again for that. I did not know the Assemblyman was actually at Cal State Northridge. Okay, thank you. At Cal State Northridge when the 94 earthquake hit. I'm a little older than he is. I was at the World Series in 1989 with the Loma Prieta earthquake, but that'll do it to you. Being at the epicenter of an earthquake or near the epicenter will convert you. What we want to do is make sure that it doesn't take that to convince people of the value of resilience. So Ron Takaguchi, thank you again, obviously, for being part of our video. You are a building official. Now, I'm not sure all of our viewers understand what a building official is or what the building department does in a city. So maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you, Evan, and USRC, and the sponsor for having me on this very esteemed panel. To answer the question about the role of a building official and what a building department does, essentially a building department of a city or a county verifies the built safety of constructed and occupied buildings. And this is achieved through established processes of permitting, contract review, engineering, and building code verification, and through building inspections. But the real function of a building department is that, and may I say the City of Burbank religiously practices this, is the assistance to the public homeowners and property owners in the development and their individual projects. The more progressive things that a building department does is look at policy issues, such as what is before us today, and looking at seismic safety and resiliency. And one of the things that I have done, and we are currently doing here in Burbank, is developing policy issues for a required or mandatory soft-story retrofit program. Up to now, Burbank has been encouraging, through voluntary efforts, soft-story retrofit, and we have had several owners be responsible and have retrofitted their buildings. And of course, when that happens, the building department works with them, and we look at the city in whole scape and seeing what vulnerabilities exist with our existing buildings, and making sure that the city is resilient moving forward. And one of the things that could be achieved is through policy.
Thanks, Ron. Now, I'm going to ask you sort of the same question that I asked the Assemblyman. Is you've been involved with and passionate about seismic resilience for a long time. You know, the role of a building official to educate the public, to make sure that building permits are issued properly. But you've really kind of gone that extra step and just had this passion around seismic retrofit over vulnerable buildings, first in Santa Monica, now in Burbank. What is it about it that is of particular interest to you?
Well, since we were talking about our experiences, let me both age myself and share an experience, and that was the 1971 Seymour earthquake. A very young child then, and I distinctly remember that as being very frightful, having experienced an earthquake for the first time. But not only that, it was the sharing of the news, the destruction that an earthquake could bring to buildings. And even at a very young age, call it a wake-up call in an earthquake and further safety, and that these things shouldn't happen. And if there's an avoidance to risk, let's take that high road. So really, to answer the question, my interest in seismic safety, seismic resiliency is very fundamentally safety and building occupancy. And if seismic resiliency is looked at in broader scope, it's really an evolution of a combination of things, where and how older buildings were built to what the standards are today, with the combination being the science of seismology, the building of behavior in seismic events, which we now know a lot more through science and engineering, development of structural engineering and building codes. But I would offer that perhaps the adjunct answer to the fundamental safety is really arriving at a point where policy furthers seismic safety resiliency. And what we could do collectively as local public officials, the scientific community and the business community, and reaching that point of developing policy that makes building safety even a greater reality. And I do want to say that the city of Burbank and our community and city council is taking that higher road. We are currently pursuing a mandatory retrofit policy for soft stories.
Well, so we're all in this process of dating ourselves. Assemblyman Nazarian experienced the 94 earthquake. I experienced the 89 earthquake. Ron experienced the 71 earthquake. Next time I'll bring someone on that was around for the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, if we could get that. But it is one of those things that you sort of remember in our business where you were when. So Matthew, while I'll bring you in here, you see seismic policy on an even larger scale, really, looking at the different states around the West, and of course your experience out east with other types of hazards. What do you think are some of the biggest gaps that we have where the state and local policies are today and where they really need to be to make us a more resilient nation?
I think that we have some significant gaps, and the primary gaps that exist is, for one thing, the existence of the policies. There are some places that have policies and some that don't, because policies are largely driven either by the home rule consideration of the jurisdictions, or in cases of other states that might be a little bit more Dillon's rule, they might have a overarching policy which doesn't fully address the hazard in one location versus the hazard in another location. So we have that consideration that's involved then. And a second consideration that has to be involved is the implementation of the policy. Quite often a policy as it's written may not be implementable because of the lack of funding that's associated with it, or the decision of a locality or of a state to be able to say, you figure out how you want to apply this policy towards your own community. And there may be some valid reasons for that based upon risk and the community in its own right, but that is a significant gap in its own consideration. perhaps the biggest gap that I see in terms of policy is the funding behind it. And Administrator Nazarian and your show and the previous video that you showed touched upon that to a large degree, where you might have the greatest and most wonderful idea in the world and the best way to be able to apply it, but if there's not any dollar behind it, then there's not any ability to be able to implement it. A third final consideration that I would look at would actually be the fact that some policies are more politically driven or controlled by entities that may have more sway with the policy writers than with the actual science. A policy, in my opinion, needs to be science-based, and the science-based has to consider the conditions, the hazard, the risk, the recovery components, but it also has to be implementable at both. And if you lack at any step or any phase of that connected purpose, then you lose, and that's where the disconnects are. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's great, Matthew. Thanks. And I think this is a good time to bring Carlos Martin in. Carlos, you work with the Urban Institute. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your own background and what the mission of the Urban Institute is?
Sure. First off, I'm dialing in from Washington, D.C., so it's good to see fellow Californians. I'm actually from El Cerrito, California, so I'm happy to always associate with my fellow Bears and Bruins, as you may be. So, as I tell everybody, I'm trained as a civil environmental engineer, got my doctorate and master's at Stanford, but I'm a houser. And that means I love using that term because it generally doesn't mean a lot to most people, which means I can define it as I want. But basically, most of my research is on housing, particularly on the physical quality of housing and how it impacts broader social outcomes. So I'm currently at the Urban Institute. I will be at the Brookings Institution in about 2 months, followed by running the directorship, being the director of the Remodeling Futures program at the Harvard University Joint Center for Housing Studies. So I'm through and through a houser. But I should also note that Urban is a 501c3, and the views that I'm expressing are my own. We do not advocate for federal or state legislation. So I appreciate the video. So I'll be speaking from my own that I appreciate the video very much from my own perspective. What we look at are the social and environmental considerations that are associated with housing. And so a lot of these in my world, because I look at physical quality of housing, has looked at energy efficiency all the way through the more recent work I've been doing on hazard mitigation, climate adaptation, and infrastructure bonds. So that's a quick way of introducing myself and introducing Think Tank World, which, like I said, doesn't really advocate on specific policies, but the ideal is that we're providing evidence to policy. So I'm a researcher in this community here.
Great. Well, Carlos, it's great to have you on, and I want to follow up with this when we talk about equity in terms of resilience. One of the things that we've tried to talk about in this series is that resilience doesn't have to be only accessible to the wealthy or to large corporations or things like that. We've showcased a number of projects, engineering, construction projects that have been done in the past that have really targeted low-income, affordable housing, smaller business owners, and so understanding, your role is not to promote or advocate policy. What are some of the things that policymakers, researchers, businesses should be looking at to make sure that we can better target resilience more equitably around our society?
Sure. So a lot of the lessons that we've developed over the last 3 decades around energy efficiency and renewable energies in housing interventions I think can apply. But there are some specificities about hazard risks, and particularly those non-climate hazard risks that we probably want to talk about as well. But I mean, these ultimately, the decisions to be equitable in programs, particularly in public sector programs, boils down to two things across all the studies I've done in every program, regardless of what the specific physical characteristic is. And that's leadership and money. And by leadership, it's political leadership. Political leaders who are willing to stick their necks out and say, we have to start thinking about the broad scope of what needs to be happening in our communities. And money, because if you're looking at equitable distribution, you're dealing with people who either have no resources of their own development, or have historically been denied, and their communities have been denied resources because of historical racism, structural inequality, et cetera. So there are a variety of ways that one can start thinking about this, but making sure that there's money for those communities to upgrade, and making sure that there is leadership that's looking out for that broader disaster safety net that is necessary. And I would argue that it's a resilient safety net, right? That we're looking not just at post-event equity, but also making sure that people have the resources and the knowledge and the capacity to deal with it beforehand.
Well, yes, thank you. You know, you've mentioned a couple of things about sort of recognizing where our vulnerable populations are and making sure there's enough resources to address their needs. And it goes, you know, beyond safety. Obviously, Assemblyman Nazarian spoke just in the last question I asked him about a bill that would look at inventorying buildings around California to identify those that are risky. So we talked about soft story buildings, older concrete, older steel buildings. But there's another term that is being really used a lot more, at least in the national level, and now at the state level in California as well, and that's functional recovery. It's this idea that true resilience is, obviously safety is the most important thing, but true resilience also means our ability to get back to our normal lives, or to be able to restore the functions that a community needs to survive and thrive. And you know, we often think about hospitals, police stations, fire stations as sort of these essential facilities. But when it comes to a lot of our population, essential facilities can simply mean housing. It can also mean grocery stores. You know, we've heard the term food deserts, where in a place like San Francisco, you know, there may be one grocery store within a half mile, and if you don't have a car and you're elderly, you know, if that store goes down, you don't have a way to get food. So this term functional recovery and expanding what we mean by essential facilities is important. And Assemblyman, you have another bill, AB 1329, that is looking at just this term functional recovery. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what that is and what it hopes to accomplish.
Thanks, Evan, and I apologize for the choppiness before. Not sure if I got all my thoughts across, but we'll roll with it at this point. So functional recovery is something I started working on with Dr. Lucy Jones. She had I had expressed to her my concerns of us not doing enough at the state level to support local jurisdictions. And instead, what I was seeing was we were coming up with policies that was going to borne the cost of making the modifications necessary to buildings, especially apartment buildings and soft story apartment buildings, on the owners of the property, who were then going to pass it down to the residents. And so, you know, and when you look at Los Angeles, when you look at the depth of need we have in a place like Los Angeles also, you know, we have many buildings from the 1920s or 30s that are still being utilized. And these are very vulnerable buildings that house typically the most vulnerable constituencies, because most of these homes are affordable housing, utilized for affordable housing. So many of them haven't been upgraded or maintained the way we would like them to. Many of them are heavy concrete brick buildings that will. We have building officials here who could speak to the dangers of that much better than I can. But when you see that you have a lot of these older buildings that could crumble in a major seismic event, uh, there still is the fear of loss of life and also displacement. Just some years ago, about 3-4 years ago, Arizona was doing drills on preparing itself on accepting 400,000 Californians who would be leaving California in a potentially strong seismic related event. So when you're looking at all these things happening, you need to question yourself of what it is you need to do as a state to make sure that you're performing on par of where you need to be. And this isn't something that we need to wait for the federal government. Again, we as a state need to be leaders on this issue because we know that we have the most frequent and high level seismic activity compared to any other state that causes the most damage. So the idea of functional recovery is when we pass the series of improvements to building standards that saved lives some 30-40 years ago, we haven't upgraded it really to ensure that during an earthquake, we make sure that the buildings that are housing businesses don't go down quickly as well. We saw the red tagging happen in '94, which was devastating. There's the loss of the billions of dollars in just the actual physical damage, but then there's a significant greater loss of dollars in the stoppage of the business activity, in the loss of income, in the loss of mortgage payments, in the loss of the trickling effect of all of these things. So it was critical to look at what can we do at the state level to ensure that we are providing the safest environment, not just for protecting lives, but for protecting businesses. So that's the path we started collaborating on, and this is now, I believe, the third iteration of the bill at this point. The first one, unfortunately, got onto Governor Brown's desk, and he decided to veto it. At the time, there was some disagreements with some of the other interest groups that had a hand in it, and wanted to say I appreciate what Matthew Wall brought up. Policy needs to be science-based. I couldn't agree with you more, Matthew. But the way we make policy is with a lot of interest groups having a say in the process. And so what ends up happening is when you have every interest group wanting their piece protected or spoken in the bill, it leaves little room for the science component, which is supposed to be the overwhelming piece in a policy that is dealing especially with Mother Nature. So I think that's where we've made some mistakes, and unfortunately, that's why I think we've had some setbacks.
Well, thank you, Assemblyman. Your work has been, really phenomenal over the past several years. I've had the pleasure of working with you and your staff, and it is a long effort. Matthew, just following up on that, in addition to your role with WISPIC, you served with the National Earthquake Program Managers Group and the National Earthquake Resiliency Coalition. These are all sort of interstate and national councils. Why is it important to have these kinds of large-scale interstate groups come together when it comes to creating resilience policy?
Well, I'd like to first off comment that there's been a couple of things that have been said here that are critical, and they're part of the crux behind why it's important to have national organizations. Dr. Martin emphasized the social vulnerability of populations. Assemblyman Nazarian talked about the implementation of the policies and the processes, and he also mentioned the exercise that Arizona had. Haywire was the name of the exercise, where they talked about having 400,000 people leaving California and going into Arizona. So what we've looked at here is we've looked at a couple of things. First off, the population at large that we're considering, and just as importantly, the cascading impacts of the events. As we look at the cascading impacts of the events, incumbent upon the states and the jurisdictions, which may be sharing the additional impacts, to be able to understand and have a standardized or a values to be able to plan and to work their policies around. And this is where these national councils come into play, because they increase the communication between individuals and politicians that might otherwise not be talking with each other. It increases and allows people to be able to look at the information, the science, and the identification of the risk and the identification of what the hazard is and how that impacts the risk, to be able to come up with solid values, to be able to say, if this happens here, what's going to happen there? And also be able to, frankly, steal the best practices and the ideas that other locations have. So as what Mr. Takaguchi was talking about with the soft story and the ordinances, that's a great and a wonderful idea. And so for another jurisdiction to be able to potentially take that idea and be able to steal it and to be able to implement that policy into their own city or their own county and be able to implement that is a wonderful aspect. So the key here is that it's a shared understanding, a combination of creating a singular language, the understanding of what the cascading impacts are going to be, and the opportunities that can be achieved through leveraging those partnerships that are there.
Thank you, Matthew. That's great. Yeah, this is not like convincing a company to move from California to Washington. This is the kind of thing that we really all need to work together, and we've seen that with COVID, right? It just takes a whole nation trying to pull together to solve this problem.
Absolutely. It is a simple fact that natural disasters do not pay attention to jurisdictional or state lines.
That's right. That's right. Ron, you're a past president of the California Building Officials. We call it CALBO. Shane Diller, who's the current president of CALBO, was on the Resilience Advantage a few months ago. And you saw that in this episode, we spoke with representatives from the Santa Monica and Culver City Chambers of Commerce. We spoke, of course, with Tracy Hernandez from LA BizFed. We spoke with a developer from Portland, Oregon, who was struggling to find some ways to incentivize what he was doing, which was restoring a 100-year-old building and making it safe. All of them mentioned things like expedited permitting being a huge motivator for them and their members to invest in resilience projects. So how do you think that the California building officials, working together, like we just talked about the need for states to do, how can California building officials working together help make those types of incentives a reality for communities around the state?
Well, first of all, regarding our current CALBO president, Shane Diller, Shane and I, as with all building officials, we're on the same page about basic fundamental building safety, as we are with policy development that furthers the message of safe occupancy. And one of the ways that we could look at how CALBO could be on the same page with the other entities is what we do in our public policy efforts. CALBO has a branch called the Public Affairs Branch. We, in fact, have a new, very capable Public Affairs Director who works with the State Assembly and Senate. And one of the things that we do is have dialogue with various legislative offices, of which I just want to honestly say that the friend and champion of seismic resiliency to building officials has been Assembly Member Nazarian with his proposed bills that he has introduced that further the effort, of which the functional recovery bill is something that is perhaps a dream to building officials, that we want a higher standard in the built environment so we could remain functional after an event. And as the Assembly member mentioned, the policy goes along with the method, and we want to work to make sure that the method is one that is could be accepted by state officials, and it could be implemented. But regarding incentives, one of the incentives that could be looked at, I think were mentioned in the introductory video, that some of the things that a local jurisdiction can consider for incentives is in the policy development itself. And that is perhaps looking at working with the developers and perhaps getting seismic retrofit completed in a faster time could perhaps be reflected in the fees that the city charges, or perhaps the time that the plan or the permit is issued. And what could further incentives is looking at policy development and as the Assembly member mentioned, incentives from state and federal entities that would strengthen the effort in helping local cities, especially the smaller cities, develop such policies that we get that incentives could be introduced to building owners.
So, Assemblyman, yeah, I mean, I echo what Ron is saying about, your work being of great interest to building officials, and, we're really happy for their support. Can you talk about maybe some of the other types of financial incentives that can be brought to bear, say, through state policies or legislation? I know you had worked on a revolving loan fund of sorts, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what kinds of things we can do to help offset the investment, that sometimes considerable investments that owners must make to make their buildings more resilient.
Sure, happy to. And by the way, Ron, I really love that idea of expediting permits or maybe even waiving fees. My only concern would be that I would hate to be the bearer of bad news of them not charging fees that they need for their own operation purposes. So long as we can do things to make sure that we're not creating a mandate for cities to lose money, I'd love to continue working with you on some of these ideas. Maybe there are ways that we can just look at how we incentivize developers also. My only concern for that would be, so long as we do it in a way that all developers do some level of upgrade, so that there's some obviously there needs to be a standard. As for incentivizing, I've tried to work on all the different facets of coming up with incentivizing, everything from single-family residents with the base and bulk program that the CEA would offer. In my first few years, I just kept on putting in more dollars into that program so that we could expand it, because it's relatively limited. And the only way that they dish out the money is by having a lottery system, because there are so many applicants. And so it was important to continuously put more funding into that fund. So I worked on that. I established a program under CalCap that would, in the treasurer's office, that would allow for up to $250,000 loan program. I'd worked on a bill to allow for seismic retrofits to be impounded into your county assessment, and for you to be able to pay it down that way. But in all of this, I really do feel that the biggest way of actually making a big impact is the most significant way of making a big impact is a tax credit or a outright grant, or a very low interest loan program that blows the cap of $250,000 for some of the major buildings. We need to provide such a major incentive that will allow building owners to want to go ahead and make the investment, and also not pass down the cost to their residents. I mean, we're already seeing how difficult it is. I was just reading a report today of how nationally 44 of the 50 largest cities, rent has climbed up at an average of 8.1%. That's significant. So, given job loss, given the tenuousness of the pandemic, given the shortage of residential units, and that's why the high increased rates of rent. The last thing you want to see also is property owners having to pass down the cost, especially at a vulnerable time like this. So I'm very much geared towards introducing or working on another tax credit. I would love to have the support of all the participants who represent their own institutions and backgrounds to be involved with this effort. The last time a tax credit bill again went to the governor, he vetoed it, but unfortunately that was because he vetoed combined 9 different tax credits because he did not want to deal with them. This was Jerry Brown again. Mm-hmm. So given the money that is coming in, given the federal support that's coming in, this next year could be a good year for us to reevaluate and see if we can move forward with another tax credit.
Thanks, Assemblyman. Carlos, there's been so much innovation in the past decade around incentivizing green design, especially at the federal level. There are green mortgage programs through organizations like HUD and Fannie Mae. I think even some private sort of green mortgage programs, other incentives and tax credits and tax breaks for green design. But that isn't yet happening for disaster mitigation and resilience. So I'd ask you, what would be some of the powerful tools or programs that might be copied from sort of the green incentive movement to resilience?
Sure. So I chuckle a bit at this question because I think folks in the energy efficiency and renewable energy world would think that there haven't had progress. So we're probably splitting hairs about which sector of the building industry has actually been able to move the advocacy needle forward. But there are certainly things that have happened at the national level with regard to energy efficiency and renewable energy that would be beneficial when thinking about seismic response. And those are things like the weatherization program that is an explicitly low income retrofit program that is directly funded, occasionally with utility supplements. LIHEAP pays people's energy bills, so one can envision something like a means-tested assistance program for the flood insurance, for CEA, et cetera, that could also be used to incentivize actual retrofits along the lines of the fortified homes world. I would say that the energy advocacy world has been much more aggressive about the building code, but we have to remember that building codes are for new building, where the seismic folks have actually had much more success on retrofit codes. The fact that soft story ordinances exist in California municipalities says a lot more about the ability of that sector to make change in the existing world. So I would say part of it, there are a lot of potential opportunities, but I do want to talk a little bit more about sort of the policy moment that can be gained, that can be leveraged for these things. And part of it is this issue of like the fact that there is a crisis of political leadership. I would not include the assemblyman in that, but I do have a question for him in a second. And oftentimes local governments local politicians view themselves as heroes after a crisis rather than as planners before a crisis. And so they don't want to face constituents who are either against changing their homes or property owners who are against changing their building or who don't have the resources to do that. So there's a fear of regulating existing buildings. I would say the seismic community in California has done has gone further than any other building advocacy group in the United States. So you should commend yourselves for this. I do want to say that one of the things I'm worried about is I'm a little less concerned about voluntary and incentive programs in this bit. I'm actually not worried about finding common ground at this point. Mainly because we don't have the time and we need to exercise some humanity in people who are living in what I would call substandard housing, which includes seismically exposed housing. So voluntary programs, we know from the energy efficiency world, don't get you as far or as quickly as you need to go. Voluntary programs often only benefit a certain segment of the population that would likely do the activity anyway. In the building sector, further, voluntary programs often end up creating boutique owners, boutique property owners, boutique homeowners, so further stratifying the building stock as well as the communities that live in those building stocks. So I would actually exercise great caution against any building ordinances, including state legislation that does building surveys that are not automatically part of a broader comprehensive program that include a robust assistance for low to moderate income households, because you'll just be creating seismic redlining. So I would actually like to hear Adrin's, I haven't read Adrin's third bill version, but I would like him to speak to that.
So, member, would you mind?
Sure, happy to. I think we would be extremely sensitive, obviously, to make sure that, and that's why I was making a comment earlier, so long as there are certain standards that applies to everyone, I'd want to work on ways of further incentivizing. So that's where my rationale comes from on these issues. And we've seen how even on the climate change related issues, we would set up funds, we would tax additionally of various corporations and companies, and then not really sometimes spend the money where it was supposed to be spent. And so over the course of the last 10, 15 years, we've made great strides and attempts in making sure that these funds are available to every segment. In fact, now with a very concerted effort of constantly focusing on the poorer communities, because they end up getting most of the emissions. So if you were to apply that to the seismic related issues, I mean, what this bill does is ensure that there is a functional recovery program, so that once the Building Standard Commission sets the standard and the cities adopt it, every city is going to be working off of that standard. So I don't think it would create any type of redlining concern. I think where we need to be nimble is that there are some locations, there are many locations in California also that do not have the geological configuration, and because of that do not have the seismicity levels that other parts of California have. And so I would not want to hold certain counties and jurisdictions as responsible to the standard that LA, for example, should be responsible for. And that's why, again, these are things that when we're making policy, you got to also be very careful in how you make it nimble at the state level, so that local jurisdictions could optimize on how best to move forward for the protection of their businesses and constituencies. Because once you make it available for local jurisdictions, and then it's up to them to figure out how they want to move forward. If they adopt it also, they have, you're basically allowing them to not deal with future costs as much. I mean, it's over time, the costs are going to be reduced with buildings being upgraded to the new standards. So I hope I'm answering your question.
Well, yeah, thank you. I think it's clear that one size does not fit all, both when it comes to communities and to building owners. The short video that we showed about retrofitting soft story buildings and providing Recovery Act or other funding for that would be targeted towards those types of buildings that most commonly, have lower income or senior folks in those buildings. So affordable housing. So direct grants to those building owners has the advantage. Well, one, it has the advantage of those are actually generally buildings that are the simplest to retrofit. but it also has the advantages of being targeted towards those communities that need it the most, where the owner won't have the option to pass on the cost of the retrofit to the tenants. But it's all about being smart and knowing how to target those retrofits where we'll do the most good and get the most done. Wow, we have reached the end of this webinar. We had some great conversations. I really wish we could take it another half hour. I'm just so appreciative of Ron Takaguchi, Carlos Martin, Matthew Wall, and of course Assemblyman Adrian Nazarian for being on our panel today. Very thankful, of course, for Tracy Hernandez, our champion for this episode, one of our champions. I think we mentioned that this is about keeping the drumbeat going. Tracy mentioned that it takes folks with a committed long-term perspective to make policy changes, to bring incentives to bear. And clearly, I hope our audience sees that these are examples of those types of leaders that are making that long-term, often painful commitment to improving our society, our communities. So with that, I want to just briefly show a slide of our promotional partners again and thank all of them for their work on supporting and sponsoring the Resilience Advantage series. I'm often asked about membership in the U.S. Resiliency Council. We're a nonprofit organization, and we would be so appreciative to have our listeners as members of the USRC to help continue this mission of bringing resilience awareness and good policy to our communities, to our nation. Lastly, I'd like to encourage you all to register for our upcoming webinars. On August 19th, we're going to be talking about earthquake liability and how resilience reduces that. And then on September 16th, we'll be talking generally about the earthquake threats in California and the West. So with that, I want to thank you all so much. Again, thank you to our panelists for attending today, and enjoy the rest of your day.